I can't wait all day. Don't be silly. It's just 2 minutes to 4. He sat down miserably, as if I had pushed him, and simultaneously there was the sound of a motor turning into my lane. We both jumped up, and a little horrored myself, I went out into the yard. Under the dripping, bare lilac tree, a large open car was coming up to the drive. It stopped, Daisy's face, tipped sideways beneath three-cornered lavender hat, looked out at me with a bright, ecstatic smile. Is this absolutely where you live, my dearest one? The exhilarating ripple of her voice was a wild tonic in the rain. I had to follow the sound of it a moment up and down, with my ear alone. Before any words came through, a damp streak of hair lay like a dash of blue. Pause. Like a dash of blue paint across her cheek, and her hand was wet with glistening drops as if I took it to help her with the car. Are you in love with me? She said low in my ear. Or why did I have to come alone? That's the secret of Castle Rackrent. Tell your chauffeur to go far away and spend an hour. Come back in an hour, Ferdy. This in a grave murmur. Pause again. His name is Ferdy. Pause. Huh? I'm making an audiobook. I'm sorry, everyone, for the inconvenience. His name is Ferdy. Does the gasoline affect his nose? I don't think so, she said innocently. Why? We went in. To my overwhelming surprise, the living room was deserted. Well, that's funny, I exclaimed. What's funny? She turned her head as if there was a light, dignified knocking at the front door. I went out and opened it. Gatsby, pale as death, with his hands plunged like weights in his coat pockets, was standing in a puddle of water, glaring tragically into my eyes. With his hands still in his coat pockets, he stalked by me into the hall, turned sharply as if he were on a wire, and disappeared in the living room. It wasn't a bit funny. Aware of the loud beating of my own heart, I pulled the door to against the increasing rain. I'm making an audiobook. I'm making an audiobook. For a half a minute, there wasn't a sound. Then, from the living room, I heard a sort of a choking murmur and part of a laugh, followed by Daisy's voice on a clear, artificial note. I certainly am awful glad to see you again. A pause. It endured horribly. I had nothing to do in the hall, so I went into the room. Gatsby, his hands still in his pockets, was reclining against the mantelpiece in a strained counterfeit of a perfect ease, even of boredom. His head leaned back so far that it rested against the face of a defunct mantelpiece clock, and from this position his distraught eyes stared down at Daisy, who was sitting, frightened but graceful, on the edge of a stiff chair. We've met before, muttered Gatsby. His eyes glanced momentarily at me, and his lips parted with an abortive attempt at a laugh. Luckily, the clock took this moment to tilt dangerously at the pressure of his head, whereupon he turned and caught it with the trembling fingers and set it back in place. Then he sat down rigidly, his elbow on the arm of the sofa and his chin in his hand. I'm sorry about the clock, he said. My own face had now assumed a deep tropical burn. I couldn't muster up a single... Alright, pause. Commonplace out of the thousands in my head. It's an old clock, I told him ironically. I think we all believed for a moment that it had smashed in pieces on the floor. We haven't met for many years, said Daisy, her voice as matter of fact as it could ever be. 5 years next November. The automatic quality of Gatsby's answer set us all back at least another minute. I had them both on their feet with the desperate suggestion that they help me make tea in the kitchen with the dynamic Finn brought in on the tray. Amid the welcome confusion of cups and cakes, a certain physical decency established itself. Gatsby got himself into a shadow, and while Daisy and I looked constantly from one or the other of us for the tense, unhappy eyes. However, as calmness wasn't an end in itself, I made an excuse at the first possible moment and got to my feet. "Where are you going?" demanded Gatsby in immediate alarm. "I'll be back. I've got to speak to you about something before you go." He followed me wildly into the kitchen, closed the door, and whispered, "Oh, God," in a miserable way. Pause. "What's the matter? This is a terrible mistake," he said, shaking his head from side to side. "A terrible, terrible mistake. You're just embarrassed, that's all," and luckily I added, "Daisy is embarrassed too." "She's embarrassed," he repeated indecorously. "Just as much as you are. Don't talk so loud. You're acting like a little boy," I broke out impatiently. "Not only that, but you're rude. Daisy's sitting in there all alone." He raised his hands to stop my words, looked at me with an unforgettable reproach, and opening the door cautiously, went back into the other room. I walked out the back way, just as Gatsby had when he had made his nervous circuit of the house half an hour before, and ran for a huge black knotted tree, whose massed leaves made a fabric against the rain. One more it was pouring, and the irregular lawn, well shaded by Gatsby's gardener, about abundant in small muddy swamps and prehistoric marshes. There was nothing to look at from under the tree except Gatsby's enormous house, so I stared at it, like Canada's church people, for a half an hour. A brewer had built it early in the period, craze, a decade before, and there was a story that he'd agreed to pay 5 years of taxes on all the neighboring cottages if the owners would have their roofs thatched with straw. Perhaps the refusal took the heart out of his plan to found a family. He went in immediate decline. His children sold his house after the black wreath still on the door. Americans, while occasionally willing to the serfs, have always been obtained by the peasantry. About a half an hour, the sun shone again, and the grocer's automobile rounded Gatsby's drive with the raw material for his servant's dinner. I felt sure he wouldn't eat a spoonful. A maid began opening the upper windows of his house, appeared momentarily in each, and leaning from a large central bay, spat meditatively into the garden. It was time I went back. While the rain continued, it had seemed like a murmur of their voices, rising and swelling, a little now, and then with gusts of emotion. But in the new silence, I felt the silence had fallen within the house, too. I went in, after making every possible noise in the kitchen, short of pushing over the stove, but I don't believe they heard a sound. They were sitting at either end of the couch, looking at each other as if some question had been asked, or was in the air, and every vestige of embarrassment was gone. Daisy's face was smeared with tears, and when I came in and she jumped up and began wiping at it with her handkerchief before a mirror. But there was a change in Gatsby that was simply confounding. He literally glowed. Without a word of gesture of exhilaration, a new well-being radiated from him and filled the little room. "Oh, hello, old sport," he said, as if he hadn't seen me for years. I thought for a moment he was going to shake hands. "It stopped raining." "Has it?" When he realized that I was talking about were twinkle bells of sunshine in the room, he smiled like a weatherman, an ecstatic patron of recurrent light, and repeated the news to Daisy. "What do you think of that?" "It stopped raining." "I'm glad, Jay." Her throat full of aching, grievely beauty, and told only for her unexpected joy. "I want you and Daisy to come over to my house," he said. "I'd like to show her around." "You sure you want me to come?" "Absolutely, old sport." Daisy went upstairs to wash her face, too late, I thought, with humiliation of my towels, while Gatsby and I waited on the lawn. "My house looks well, doesn't it?" he demanded. "See how the whole front of it catches the light?" I agreed that it was splendid. "Yes." His eyes went over it. "Every 8 arched door and square tower, it took me just 3 years to earn the money that brought it." "I thought you inherited your money." "I did, old sport," he said automatically, "but I lost most of it in the big panic, the panic of the war." I think he hardly knew that what he was saying, for when I asked him what business he was in, he answered, "That's my affair," before he realized that it was my appropriate reply. "Oh, I've been in several things," he corrected himself. "I was in the drug business, and then I was in the oil business, but I'm not in either one now." He looked at me with more attention. Do you mean you've been thinking over what I proposed the other night? Before I could answer, Daisy came out of the house, and 2 rows of brass buttons on her dress gleamed in the sunlight. The huge place, 3. There, she cried, pointing. Do you like it? I love it, but I don't see how you live there all alone. I keep it always full of interesting people, night and day. People who do interesting things. Celebrated people. Instead of taking the shortcut along the Sound, we went down the road and entered by the big postern. With enchanting murmurs, Daisy admired the aspect, or that, all the feudal silhouette against the sky, admired the gardens, the sparkling odor of yokels, and the frothy odor of hawthorn and plum possums, and the pale gold odor of Kiss Me at the Gate. It was strange to reach the marble steps and find no stir of bright dresses in and out the door, and hear no sound but bird voices in the trees. And inside, as we wandered through Marie Antoinette music rooms, and restoration salons, I felt that there were guests concealed behind every couch and table, under orders, to my breathlessly silent, until we had passed through. As Gatsby closed the door of the Merton College Library, I could have sworn I heard the owl-eyed men break into ghostly laughter. We went upstairs through period bedrooms, swathed in rose and lavender silk and vivid with new flowers, through dressing rooms and pool rooms and bathrooms with sunken baths, including into one chamber where a disheveled man in pajamas was doing liver exercise on the floor. It was Mr. Klipspringer, the boarder. I had seen him wandering hungrily about the beach that morning. Finally, we came to Gatsby's own apartment, a bedroom and a bath, and an Adam's study, where we sat down and drank a glass of some Chartreuse. He took the cupboard in the wall. He had at once ceased looking at Daisy, and I think he revalued everything in his house according to the measure of the response it drew from her well-loved eyes. Sometimes, too, he stared at the possessions in a dazed way, as though in her actual and astounding presence none of it was any longer real. Once he nearly toppled down a flight of stairs. His bedroom was the simplest room of all, except when the dresser was garnished with a toilet set of pure dull gold. Daisy took the brush with delight and smoothed her hair, whereupon Gatsby sat down, shaded his eyes, and began to laugh. It's the funniest thing, old sport, he said hilariously. I can't when I try to. He had passed visibly through 2 states, and he was entering upon a third. After his embarrassment and his unreasoning joy, he was consumed with wonder at his presence. He had been full of the idea so long, dreamed it right through to the end, waited with his teeth set, so to speak, and an inconceivable pitch of intensity. Now in the reaction, he was running down like an overwound clock.